Hey, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Blind Ambition with Jack Kelly. It's your friend Rick from Blind, and today we are going to introduce you to Terence Bennett, who's the CEO of DreamFactory Software, an API code automation platform. Before DreamFactory, he ran operations at Integrate.io and worked at Google as a member of its offensive security red team. Terence also served in the U.S. Navy as a naval intelligence officer in the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, and a surface warfare officer during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Thanks for coming on the show, Terence.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Jack, for having me.
A pleasure. If you don't mind if I jump in with the last part. So you started out like a war guy, right? Is that what happened? And then you pivoted over? I don't know the right words to say, but is that when you said Iraq? It's like, are you carrying a gun around and like, what will you do?
Yeah, I'll be happy to run through it. So my career really started at the Naval Academy right after high school. 4 years there, then I commissioned as a surface warfare officer. I went to a ship, literally like day one. I'm given a division that I'm to manage 10 gunner's mates, which gunner's mates are the folks who operate everything from the 5-inch like huge deck cannon. Those rounds are 5 inches wide, not 5 inches long, to like 9mm M16, any weapon on the ship. And we deployed to Iraq. We entered the Arabian Gulf on January 1st of 2011. We were operating in the northern Arabian Gulf where Iraqi waters are. So Iraq has about 13 miles of coastline, and that's where almost all their oil comes out of Iraq to enter the global market, right? So it's really important from an economic engine perspective. And we were working directly with the Iraqi Navy, training, carrying firearms on small boats and on the oil platform, and doing security. About 10 years earlier, terrorists exploded a small boat near that platform, killing a number of U.S. Coast Guard sailors. And so it's an important mission. I was there for a really interesting time because it was during the Arab Spring. We also happened to be in the Gulf when we fired missiles into Libya and started that whole operation. I was in the Gulf when SEALs caught bin Laden. I joke about this. I was probably one of the last people on earth to know bin Laden had been captured because we were in complete and total radio silence for like 3 days. The whole world found out and processed this information by the time our internet access got turned back on. I was out there for the Arab Spring, and I saw, frankly, the craziness of what was going on and just how completely blindsided we were. It really motivated me to switch over to the intelligence field. So after my 2 years were up as a surface warfare officer, switched over into intelligence, first at the Office of Naval Intelligence, then at NCIS. I deployed during that time to West Africa, Central Africa. But to answer your question, Jack, yeah, we were in theater.
So it sounds like after a while, you're like, wait a minute, do I want to be in a boat getting shot at? Maybe let me get something on the intelligence side. Is that the type,
It wasn't necessarily that I didn't want to do that bleeding edge kind of operations side. I actually loved that, and I did sort of miss it after I left it. It was more that I was looking for something a little more intellectual and cognitively interesting to me. I'd taken up some intelligence classes, international politics, international economy classes at the Naval Academy, and I knew I was really interested in intelligence work. And as a surface warfare officer, your day-to-day job is helping your team and making sure everyone is prepared and capable to operate the ship. So that means fixing fire pumps and working on radar systems, a lot of drills, driving the ship, and that stuff's fun. But I was looking for something different. I actually did deploy as an intelligence officer. Definitely got my fill there.
And then you pivoted more towards a tech-oriented role?
I spent that time at O&I, Office of Naval Intelligence, doing a lot of IT work, and it was during that time I really fell in love with tech. I was definitely a nerd in high school. I built computers and enjoyed tech, and then I stepped away from that, and then I rediscovered that, learning some coding and building apps and websites and doing that kind of stuff in my free time in the Navy. So when I decided it was time to get out, it was pretty clear to me I wanted to go to a tech company. I wanted to go to the biggest, baddest tech company I could find. I really wanted to work at Google. I talked to a lot of people and they were like, hey, like, good luck, but you really have nothing to offer Google. They're not looking for a naval intelligence officer. They're looking for technical program managers, people who've worked within the tech field, right? And it's really hard to show a recruiter the value that you're going to bring from a completely different industry that frankly speak a different language entirely. So applied to some roles. It turned out one of those recruiters sat next to an admin recruiter, what they call an administrative business partner, which is essentially a an EA. And they saw that I'd been an EA for 1 year at the Office of Naval Intelligence. It's really common for a senior officer to grab a junior officer and pull them up to the front office to act as their executive assistant. It gives you an inside scoop on how the sausage gets made, because those folks will go on to take senior command. So I had done this role, and it was the shoe-in for Google. And so at Google, I was an executive assistant for 2 years. I was super lucky. I worked for an amazing manager who was then the head of product for all of cloud storage and databases and a lot of Google infrastructure. Learned a ton, recalibrated around tech, both from cultural standpoint and language standpoint. There's a lot of nuance around how people communicate in the workplace. It's different. And less than 2 years in the role, he actually tapped me on the shoulder and was like, Terence, I absolutely love working with you, but I want to find you a new role. I think you've exhausted your potential here. So he helped me find a new role on Google's Red Team, which was a great fit from my previous Intel experience. And did that for about 2 years before stepping over into the startup world.
Can you walk us through what a red team means? I understand the security lingo obviously comes from the military, or perhaps not obviously for our audience. Can you explain that terminology and what the day-to-day might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right, Rick. The terminology does come from the military. My understanding is the early red teams were Green Berets who were doing essentially offensive testing on physical security of military bases. The idea of this sort of entered the zeitgeist and became even bigger. Networks are not, frankly, that different of the theoretical level to physical security, right? So it's a powerful analogy to use. One of the misconceptions around red teaming is it's essentially pen testing, and it's different. Penetration testing, there's 3 types: black box, gray box, white box. And really the intent with a pen test is to scope a project down to a very specific application or system, then try and poke as many holes in it as possible. The goal being, how many vulnerabilities can we find? A black box means you have no prior knowledge. White box means you have total access, and gray is somewhere in the middle. Red teaming will often find vulnerabilities, but a red team exercise is about the complete and total start to finish process of an attacker would take in completing an objective. So just like a Green Beret, the goal might be to compromise some sensitive technology. Like any way they go about doing that is up to them. It's the same with a red team attacker. Let's say we're going to pretend that we're an adversary who's very interested in this specific data set. Let's say quantum computing, intellectual property. They could go any number of different ways through Google's infrastructure to get to that. We're not bound in any way there. Whereas with a pen test, you're specifically bound to hitting a specific system. Red teaming also starts from 0 foothold. So the first step in every red team exercise is planning. How do we get a foothold into the network? And the foothold's almost always a phishing campaign. Our team used to, on a regular basis, sit down and brainstorm different phishing campaigns, or what actually more accurately, whaling campaigns, where you're targeting a very specific person on a very specific team, because you need their credentials, their tokens, to gain access to the next layer. But you find that often the way you go about getting into the thing is not through the front door. It's through like the doggy door in the back, right? And that's the point. You don't actually know where the vulnerability is. It might not actually be in the application that you think it's in. It could be somewhere else completely. The other piece of a red team exercise is actually the cat and mouse game between a red team and a blue team. So there's a defense. A pen test doesn't take into consideration there's someone actively defending that network. And Google's got a world-class blue team that they built out after a well-publicized breach they had in 2009. And they've recruited world experts in blue team and cyber network defense to protect that network. And so we very quickly would set off kind of alarm bells within the network, and we would be chased by the blue team in a real-life game of cat and mouse in Google's networks. My role as a program manager was often to coordinate that interaction, because at a certain point, the blue team has to tell management that, hey, we have an active breach. Blue team leadership, it would come to me if they think they found us, and then we would sort of negotiate what the next step was, figuring out how can we stretch this out as much as possible for the benefit of both teams, while also not tripping an alarm and Sundar getting a call in the middle of the night that Google's networks would bring. So, yeah, it's a really fun job. I had a blast with it.
You're literally competing. Is there a case where you quote unquote lose because the blue team just caught you and you're not so good? What does that performance look like? I mean, if you do well, necessarily the other team might be doing not so well, or they're we've discovered some vulnerabilities there, right?
In hacker lingo, right, you would drop a kit or a RAT, which is a random access tool. You drop those on different computers or systems to get access
Okay.
again. So the game is really the blue team trying to find those and kill those and remove them faster than you can move around and plant them. And it all really comes down to your ability to lateral movement between systems as fast as possible without it's an OODA loop, right? If you're familiar with the Air Force term, observe, orient, decide, act, right? Like how fast is your OODA loop with regard to the adversary's OODA loop? And a blue team will, if they can get inside if they can move faster than you're moving, just like aircrafts flying, they will be able to push you out of the network. And yeah, it's not a failure for the organization, right? Like they've still learned a ton, and that blue team has gotten incredible experience and training, right? But there's definitely a healthy rivalry between teams. And we sat in the same building, which is pretty hilarious too.
In real life, I take it that goes on too, right? That it's always that back and forth mouse and cat kind of thing, chasing each other.
In larger organizations, absolutely. And those another word for blue team is DNR, detection and response. And that's really what they're trying to do. They're detecting and they're responding to network intrusions. And anyone in this world long enough will quickly learn that there's no series of events that doesn't end up with an attacker getting access to a network if they've got enough resources and time. Any adversary given enough resources and time will get access to whatever they want. I'll say that again. Any adversary with enough time and resources will get access to what they want. It's a matter of can detection response find them and push them out within time. The reality is these things are very sensitive and classified and close hold, so you don't really hear about them very often. But when you hear news about a large breach, there's some sort of detection event that happened and a long investigation and process of pushing that bad actor out. And often it's incredibly disruptive to an organization. In some cases, essentially shut down whole systems, like an email system, and essentially like reboot it to flush out all those rats and all those kits that have been placed around the network. It's kind of crazy. It's the equivalent of having to sweep a whole warehouse of potential bugs or whatever and flush the whole thing and start over.
Zoom in a little bit into the transition from military life into Google. It seems like, especially on the security team, there's a lot of military parlance or processes that might make the transition easy. But before then, you were a project manager, you're an EA. How did you find that move from military life to civilian life?
It was difficult. So I won't tiptoe around that. It's a very difficult transition because anyone who's joining the military typically has been thinking about it for some time, right? Not like it's not like a flip of the coin, wake up one day and decide you're going to join the service, at least typically. So I was interested in the Navy as a middle schooler. When I was an Eagle Scout, like I was always drawn to service. There's something about the idea of something greater than yourself that's really motivated me. And then you do that job for a decade. It's a big decision to decide to get out. I think there's always a bit of apprehension and the fear you're going to regret it, right? Like this is all you really know. So then you get out and you're trying to figure out how you fit in this world. It's challenging. And I think anyone will tell you that. What a lot of people end up doing is they end up staying adjacent to their old job. Maybe they get out and they end up in federal service. Maybe they end up as a contractor, defense tech. And I totally get why you would do that. I, for some reason, was very adamant about not doing that. And I'm not sure why. I think I wanted to prove to myself that I can make it. There's a bunch of great resources out there. One of them is called Veterati. VETERATI. And it's actually a huge network of folks who volunteered to take calls with veterans. And that's all it is interviewing, chatting with folks in industry. I remember thinking I wanted to go into investment banking. And I talked to some investment bankers and I said, no, thanks, I'm good. I talked to people in PR. For some reason, I felt like PR was a really cool fit. And I got a sense of from talking to them, that wasn't what I wanted to do. And so I talked to dozens of people before settling on tech, which I'd already had a strong predilection for. Once I selected the industry or the area I wanted to work, I then read as many books as I could find written by people from those organizations. I did a transition program through Deloitte called Deloitte Core, which huge shout out to Deloitte. Incredible work they've done in this area. And it was during a workshop, one of their guest speakers, a veteran from Starbucks. And he said, the first question I ask every single applicant is, have you read the book about Starbucks? And the CEO had written. He's like, it's a really simple test. Like, if you're interested in Starbucks, you should do your research. And who better to learn from than the CEO of Starbucks talking about Starbucks and its culture and and what they're about, right? So there's a book called How Google Works, written by Larry and Sergey Schmidt. And it's quite literally the manual on Google. And I listened to it twice. Literally, I found myself mimicking speech patterns of that book in my interview subconsciously. And I think it was a really powerful and effective way, subtly and almost subconsciously communicate cultural fit. This might sound a little bit crazy, but as you're looking to switch between industries, especially massive different industries like tech and defense, any sort of leg up you can have in being able to convince people that you're a culture fit and you get them and get their industry and get where they're coming from is a pretty good place to start.
It makes a lot of sense. I've been a recruiter for 25 years, and then they go through what you were going through, trying to figure out, what do I want to do with my life now? I'm at a transition point, and it's a difficult decision to make because you feel comfortable one way. Now you're getting out of your comfort zone and moving to something else. And you've did all your homework to say, all right, if I'm going to go into this new sector, I got to know what I'm talking about. And so you did your research. It take a lot of courage to make that big pivot.
Another way to think about it is, frankly, from the intelligence perspective, an intelligence officer's job is to know blue forces, red forces. Blue forces are your own forces, and then red forces are the opponent. You want to get in the head of the adversary. So if you're deploying to, the Northern Arabian Gulf, it means that you should be reading about Muslim culture, Islamic history, the Iran-Iraq War, the history of that war. You should be learning as much as you possibly can about those people, to the point where you start to deeply empathize with them, because that means you're at a place where you actually understand their thinking. Going back to this OODA loop concept, allows you to get inside their thought process. Now, Google was never my adversary, right? I wanted a job there. But I think there's a powerful analogy of trying to get inside the thinking and understanding of how these people operate if you're going to go try and work there. And that goes for anyone looking for a job. Find the book, because in many cases, especially these big companies, there is literally the book that was written about the company. And if you haven't done that, then I don't think you're really serious about wanting to be part of that culture.
Yeah, I think that's such good advice because I think, Jack, maybe you've heard this, right? Or you've seen this. There's different career experts, and they always say, research the company, look into the people that are going to interview you, but no one does it. And it just seems like such an obvious thing to do, right? Just to be prepared for the interview, just to understand what you're getting yourself into, going into a situation eyes wide open. Why do you think that people don't take that step?
It's interesting because you're 100% right. Too often you go in there and then you get asked the question, hey, so why do you want to work at Starbucks? And they're like, because they really didn't have a passion for it. They don't do their homework. They don't know the culture, everything, that he's been talking about, they don't do. I think a lot of people just feel overly confident. They're just going to wing it. Like, I'm so great and I'm so smart. That's all right. I could do it. But the reality is, you have to do that homework and do the research and really understand it. So when you go there, it makes you look really smart. And then they want to hire you because they feel, hey, this guy put a lot of time and effort and energy in terms of researching Starbucks and what it's about. And he went to 5 different locations to try their coffee and see what's going on there, read a book about Howard Schultz, the founder. So then the interviewer is like, wow, all right, this person's really interested in this company. They're not just slinging their resume, hoping to get a hit. They really want to do it. It's smart because you were doing this the whole time, where most people, white collar people, who doing this for a living, don't even bother, which is wild.
It's interesting. I didn't even realize I was doing it till after the fact. I get a lot of people reach out to me on LinkedIn wanting to chat, typically former military, and I always take those calls. I think it's really important. And I would always just say, like, if you work at Google, start by reading the book. Literally, don't do anything else until you read the book or listen to it, because it might actually confirm that you want to work there. It might actually tell you that this isn't a fit. But to your point, Jack, Google loves asking that question of why Google. And this might sound kind of cynical, but when you read the book, you're going to hear all the people there talking about why they love Google, and it's going to deeply influence your answer to a point where you might inadvertently be repeating back what you read in the book, and thus what people are saying internally. It's sort of a psychological mirroring, right? People are simple creatures at the end of the day, and as long as it's not coming from a place of manipulation, I think it's a very reasonable way to go about the interview process and try to think about, where do I fit culturally and where am I going to thrive?
Going one step further, it seems like you're clearly a match for Google. The work that you were doing, especially more recently, as part of the security team. What made you decide to transition away from Google and head to the startup life? Most people want to do the exact opposite, but you swam against the current. Why?
There's an old joke at Google that everyone's goal at Google is to eventually leave Google, start a company, get acquired, and come back to Google.
Okay.
I think it's in the sort of culture of Google coming from the startup world and have tons of people who come through startups to Google. For me, it was actually more nuanced and personal. I'm very dyslexic and I don't thrive in structured, as ironic as this sounds coming from the military, I don't thrive in structured organizations, right? I don't thrive with hierarchy or thrive in positions with a lot of autonomy. Believe it or not, as a junior officer in the military, I had an absurd amount of autonomy to do my job. There's very clear guardrails around what you're able to do. Obviously, law of war and regulation and doctrine, right? But at the end of the day, like the way you go about running your department, your division is pretty much up to you. It felt a little suffocated at Google, to be perfectly honest. As a program manager, there was so much structure around me and how I could do my job. It just it's not that it wasn't fun anymore. I love the people. I still miss them. I was just looking for more. I took that team from essentially just a handful of employees in the US. It was mainly a Zurich-based team, to tripled in size by the time I left. I built that program out and it was in a great position to pursue and keep moving in the direction it was moving. And I was ready for another challenge. The startup world is perfect for me. And the irony is running a company and having a P&L and managing a team of folks and having to make payroll and having to decide on strategy and having to report to the board on growth. I am still the least stressed out I think I've ever been in my professional life compared to my time in the Navy and at Google. I am fine answering big picture decisions and strategy decisions. Where I struggle is someone looking over my shoulder and judging my work at the micro level. And I think it goes back to this dyslexia. And I don't recommend anyone say this in an interview. I actually struggle with detail-oriented work, right? I thank God I've got spell check and Grammarly, and I've got all the tools around me to help me. But I was always stressed out around how I was perceived within Google. And I think this is something a lot of people struggle with. It's referred to internally as imposter syndrome. I never felt good enough. I never felt like I was actually succeeding at an acceptable level. Even if that was sort of subtle and almost like a chronic kind of stress under the surface, it led me to look for other things. I had this intuition that the startup world would be a better fit for me.
For what it's worth, we see that a lot happening, where it could be at a great company, but at the same time you say, you know what, there's more to life. Let me take a look. Let me see what I can do. Because otherwise I'll always regret it if I stayed there and I just kind of flatlined and I never really grow. So let me try, see what happens. And then maybe I could always come back.
Yeah, exactly right. Google actually has a whole team of recruiters that do nothing but recruit former Googlers back. Because I think the thought is if you're culture fit once, you'll be a culture fit again.
It's a boomerang.
Did you find it easy, quick to transition from being that individual contributor to becoming a chief executive, someone in a leadership role? Because of your military background, has leadership always been a bit easier for you to take on?
I had a perfect launchpad, if you will. I first took over operations at a small password manager, cybersecurity focused company called Team Password. The background here is that company and the company I work for now, DreamFactory, are both owned by the same parent company. I was brought in to help with operations. It was actually a veteran who brought me in who thought I'd be a good fit culturally and able to take on. So I took on a team of about 5 people and helped clean up the operations and drive strategy. And I loved it and I was having a blast. And then leadership within the larger organization said, hey, we're impressed with how things are going. Do you want to take on this other role? So I took on DreamFactory first as director of operations for a year, and then I stepped into the CEO role. So I actually had a nice glide path and ramp. I had the opportunity to get my feet underneath me, and there's obviously a lot of skills there. I did study economics, so the accounting wasn't too much, but it takes a while to figure all these things out. A lot of acronyms and SAS to figure out for sure.
We in our podcast, we often talk about pivotal promotions or career points. It sounds like this was one of them for you. What were some of kind of the ugly parts, if you don't mind us diving into it? How did you persevere and get past those moments where you thought, gosh, like I had it great at Google. Should I have really done this? Now I'm responsible for running payroll. Other folks are depending on me for their livelihood. What was that like?
I try to highlight this to veterans all the time. I actually took a pay cut when I went from not just Google to Team Password, but I actually took a pay cut of take-home pay when I went from the Navy to Google.
Wow.
I tell people that sometimes life is one step back to take 2 steps forward, right? As an admin at Google, I was getting paid less than I was getting paid in DC. but I was living in Sunnyvale, California, one of the most expensive zip codes. And we used to joke at lunch, like, I love the stock, but like I can't pay my rent in Google options. So that's a decision you have to make with your partner. Thankfully, we had some flexibility. I think a lot of it, frankly, came down to the fact that my wife and I, both former Navy, we both had this strategic path in mind around what that looked like. And even though we had a young family, we were happy to tighten our belt in the short term, knowing that there was a ton of upside down the road. And then making their jump from Google, like you get really comfortable at Google with the equity, making that jump to a startup where it's just a very different sort of pay package structure on upside. At times felt a little bit crazy. In the end, it worked out. As for moments of doubt, I've been lucky to have just phenomenal teams. There's those points where you have kind of your oh shit moments. But I think the Navy's taught me to persevere, to look at things in context, to not kind of freak out. Everything, with the right perspective is manageable. So I've never really looked back at Google and said, I wish I hadn't left. I think that just speaks to the quality of the organizations I've been lucky enough to join. And frankly, the leadership we have within our parent company is called Xenon Partners. It's just been amazing. And they're the type of leader they want to see everyone succeed. It's a super low ego environment, and they're just trying to figure out how can we all be successful here and work together on strategy, work together on making things. So it's been a good ride.
Along your way, you found different folks to really champion your career. Now that you're in that executive leadership position yourself as the CEO, how are you giving back to other folks? You mentioned this earlier. You speak with veterans regularly. You give them advice about getting into tech, getting into Google. What other things are you doing?
Taking those calls with veterans is something I really prioritize. I take at least one or two a week. I become active with the VFW locally. I try and give back in the small town that I live. I'm a member of ASTIA, which is a group that helps fund female-backed companies as an industry advisor. So I meet with prospective investments and gauge their business plan and technological feasibility. I joined the board of Shields and Stripes, which is a nonprofit helping veterans with PTSD. I become really passionate about the mental health side of veteran transition. I had my own challenges with depression while I was at Google, actually. I was thankful that I was at Google at the time and I had great health insurance and got the resources I need to find the way out. But mental health isn't talked about enough in our country. It's definitely not talked about enough within the veteran community. I think there's this sense of either you're good or you're not, and obviously everyone's on a spectrum, and you never know if someone's having a good day or not. Shields and Stripes is really trying to help people at the end of the spectrum in a place of crisis. So that's really important work for me. And I recently joined the board of the American Red Cross for Northern California coastal region, which has been really rewarding work as well. Obviously, more holistic across society. I'm in the Bay Area. I live halfway between San Francisco and Sacramento, and wildfires have clearly been huge kind of humanitarian crisis out here. What you find is it's really humbling. Just sitting in the room during these conversations and being able to add some perspective provides massive value to organizations.
I really appreciate this walkthrough in terms of how you manage it all and your career arc in terms of knowing what you wanted to get yourself into, joining the military, transitioning from the military into civilian life, into the tech world, and then finally becoming a chief executive. I think this career arc is something a lot of our listeners could do well modeling after. So thanks, Terence.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Terence.
That's it for The Blind Ambition. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and a review. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.